Elderberry Lodge was the sort of place that seemed to have stepped out of a postcard. Whitewashed stone walls, manicured hedges, and a view of the surrounding downs that gave the impression time had stopped somewhere in 1883. On this particularly fine Saturday in June, the gardens were in their full glory. The roses were in bloom, the bees hummed industriously, and the good ladies of St. Bede's Parish had gathered in full force for Mrs. Caroline Amesbury's annual midsummer garden fete. It was a time-honored affair, strawberry scones under cream umbrellas, the clink of bone china teacups, and the low, cheerful murmur of village gossip flowing beneath it, all like a lazy river. There was a tombola near the rhododendrons, a modest cake competition by the gazebo, and an ill-attended poetry reading behind the peony beds. The Reverend Pritchard looked vaguely terrified by a slice of gooseberry tart forced upon him by Mrs. Withers, and Major Penhaligon was already into his second brandy lemonade before noon. Miss Jane Marple, quietly seated beneath a willow tree, was knitting a rather uninspired sock for her great-nephew and watching the social pageant unfold with her usual soft attentiveness. She had seen too many garden parties in her time to be enchanted, and far too many murders in her long life to mistake civility for innocence. It was not until the raffle began, hosted with overzealous gaiety by Mrs. Amesbury's rather brusque cousin, Reginald Bretherton, that anything out of the ordinary occurred. The prizes were the usual sort: a sherry decanter, a voucher for thistle and stitch haberdashery, and, curiously, a small antique writing desk of mahogany, which Reginald seemed oddly eager to be rid of. "And finally," Reginald announced, holding up a yellowed envelope for all to see, "we have this rather peculiar addition." Found in the drawer of the desk, no doubt forgotten, an unopened letter, postmarked 1916. A ripple of amusement went through the crowd. "Well now," chuckled Mrs. Banbury, the retired schoolmistress, "perhaps it's a love letter from a soldier long fallen in France." "Oh, how romantic!" swooned Miss Kitty Penhaligon, who had been nursing unrequited feelings for the village doctor for 3 summers now. Reginald grinned awkwardly. "Well, whoever it's for, the name on the envelope is Mrs. Beatrice Lonsdale. Anyone remember her?" The laughter stopped. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. Beatrice Lonsdale. The name fell over the garden like a dropped veil. "That's odd," murmured Mrs. Withers to no one in particular. "Beatrice Lonsdale drowned in the mill pond 30 years ago. Summer of 45. Found with a brooch clutched in her hand. Remember?" "I remember," said Miss Marple, her voice soft and far away, as if from behind a curtain. "She was 22. Married just a year. There were questions." "Oh, but surely," protested the vicar's wife, "that was all long settled." A tragic accident. Reginald cleared his throat. "In any case, the letter's here. Damned strange, though. Returned through the post just yesterday. No sender. Stamped as undeliverable and, here's the curious thing, bearing today's date." A sudden hush fell over the gathering. In the distance, a peal of church bells began to toll, oddly out of time. Then a scream rang out, sharp, high, and panicked, from the direction of the house. It was Clara Amesbury, the hostess's young maid, running breathlessly toward the lawn. "There's someone. In the study. Oh, Lord, it's terrible. He's dead, dead as anything, just slumped there." Teacups clattered to the ground. Miss Marple stood, slowly folding her knitting into her handbag. The sun went on shining, the roses still bloomed. But in the heart of Elderberry Lodge, death had come calling. The scream sent a shiver through the garden, silencing the murmurs, halting the cheerful bustle. Miss Marple was already moving toward the house, her steps measured but purposeful, knitting tucked away as if she had sensed the sudden shadow settling over the day. The villagers followed with varying degrees of alarm and curiosity, the excitement of the garden fete instantly replaced by the weight of something much graver. Inside Elderberry Lodge, the air was heavy, scented faintly with the aroma of old wood and the faintest trace of lavender from the sachets Mrs. Amesbury kept in her drawers. The study door stood ajar, and through the narrow gap a terrible sight awaited. Reginald Bretherton lay slumped over his desk, one hand resting limply on a pile of yellowed papers, the same antique writing desk now a grim tableau. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling, and a dark stain spread across the front of his crisp white shirt. A letter opener, its silver handle glinting wickedly, was buried deep in his chest. Clara Amesbury's face was pale, and her voice trembled as she repeated, "I found him like this when I brought him the tea, miss. I don't know who would do such a thing." "It's horrid." Mrs. Amesbury appeared from the hallway, her usual composure gone, replaced by shock that quickly gave way to a brittle determination. "Call the police." "At once," she demanded, though her hands shook as she did so. Miss Marple approached quietly, her sharp eyes already noting the details others overlooked. The carefully arranged papers, the untouched teacup beside the desk, the way Reginald's body sagged, not as if in pain, but as if surrendering to something final and sudden. Outside, the village was awakening to the news faster than any announcement could have spread. Voices buzzed like angry bees, speculation blooming like weeds in spring. By the time Inspector Harold Finch arrived, the garden fete had long since dissolved into a gathering of somber faces and whispered conjectures. Finch was a stout man with keen eyes, efficient and eager to solve the case, quickly. He cordoned off the study and began questioning the onlookers, but it was clear he was eager for a straightforward culprit. "Any known enemies, Mrs. Amesbury? Anyone who might wish Mr. Bretherton harm?" Finch asked, though his tone suggested he expected a simple answer. Mrs. Amesbury hesitated, then shook her head. "Reginald was difficult at times, but I can't imagine anyone wanted him dead." Miss Marple stood a little apart, watching as the inspector collected statements. The villagers' faces flickered with a mix of fear, suspicion, and self-interest. The vicar's wife was clutching her prayer book tightly, Mrs. Banbury muttering about the tragedy and the frailty of human nature, and the major was puffing up his chest, clearly annoyed at being interrupted mid-brandy. "What of this letter, then?" Miss Marple asked gently, stepping forward. "The one found in the desk?" Inspector Finch glanced at her with polite skepticism. "An interesting coincidence, perhaps, but I see no connection." "But you must consider," Miss Marple persisted softly, "that the letter may have been the cause of his death rather than mere chance." The room seemed to still at that. No one had thought to link the curious letter to the murder yet. The letter, after all, was so old, so long forgotten. The inspector frowned, but nodded for her to continue. Miss Marple drew closer to the desk, eyes scanning the scattered papers. She picked up the letter envelope that Reginald had held in his hand. A yellowed, fragile thing. The ink faded, but the address still legible. Mrs. Beatrice Lonsdale, Elderberry Lodge. She turned it over, noticing the postmark. It was indeed dated the day before, returned as undeliverable. "A letter from the dead," Miss Marple mused aloud, her voice calm but filled with unspoken depth. Mrs. Banbury leaned forward, whispering, "Beatrice Lonsdale." Such a sad story. Everyone thought her death was an accident, but I remember whispers of scandal. Her husband, Charles, was not a good man. "Do you think," Miss Marple said, "that this letter could be related to the secrets buried long ago? Secrets some might prefer to stay hidden?" The inspector's eyes narrowed. "We will look into the history, Miss Marple. But for now, we must concentrate on who had the opportunity to kill Reginald Bretherton yesterday or today." Opportunity narrowed the suspects. Clara Amesbury, the maid, was still shaken but cooperative. The other guests and villagers had all been accounted for. Yet, as Miss Marple listened to the testimonies, she sensed that beneath the veneer of politeness, tension simmered. The vicar's wife, for instance, was oddly quiet when asked about Reginald, and Mrs. Withers was quick to defend herself from an unspoken accusation of being overly nosy. Major Penhaligon's irritation seemed less about the interruption and more about having his reputation disturbed. And then there was Mrs. Banbury, who looked as if she held a secret close to her heart. Curious how Reginald was so eager to part with that writing desk, Miss Marple remarked quietly to herself. And that letter. Later, as the day waned and the police began their formal investigation, Miss Marple retreated briefly to the quiet of the garden. The roses still smelled sweet, the bees were busy at their business, and the village continued to murmur beneath a cloud of fear. She thought of Beatrice Lonsdale, young and doomed, clutching a brooch in the mill pond, her death wrapped in mystery and whispered rumors. What message could a letter from the past carry? What resentments had festered long enough to erupt into violence now? When Mrs. Amesbury returned to the garden, flustered but composed, Miss Marple greeted her with a gentle smile. "Caroline, I wonder if you could tell me more about your cousin Reginald." He seemed a complicated man. Mrs. Amesbury sighed, brushing a stray hair from her face. "He was, Jane. Clever, but not always kind. Always scheming, it seemed. He never liked being overlooked, and he had a way of making enemies without really trying." Miss Marple nodded. "And this letter, have you any idea why it was returned after all these years?" "No one does," Caroline admitted. "The housekeeper found it while cleaning the study yesterday. We all thought it just a forgotten relic until Reginald announced he'd raffle it off. Then this murder." There was a pause. Then Miss Marple said softly, "Sometimes the past does not rest quietly, Caroline. It waits, watching." As twilight deepened over Elderberry Lodge, a cold wind stirred the rose petals, scattering them across the lawn like forgotten whispers. The village was no longer a peaceful haven. Beneath its quaint surface, secrets churned. Secrets Miss Marple intended to unravel, one subtle thread at a time. The news of Reginald Bretherton's murder spread through the village of St. Bede's like a sudden storm, unsettling the calm routines of daily life and awakening long-dormant suspicions. By Sunday morning, the tiny community was awash with gossip, speculation, and a growing sense of unease. The garden fete had been a mere memory, replaced by whispered conversations in the market, hurried exchanges in the post office, and hushed discussions behind lace curtains. Miss Marple observed all this with quiet interest from her modest cottage on the village's edge. Though she remained physically apart from the swirling voices, she was keenly attuned to the patterns of speech and behavior that offered the richest clues. The villagers, it seemed, were eager to talk, and in their eagerness, to reveal more than they intended. At the local tea room, the epicenter of social activity, Mrs. Withers was holding court with a small but attentive group. "I told you from the start, there's more to Reginald's death than meets the eye," she declared, tapping her finger on the table with emphasis. "That letter, who knows what old scandals it might dredge up? You mark my words, it's connected." Across the room, the vicar's wife sat stiffly, her fingers entwined in her lap, unwilling to engage in what she clearly considered idle speculation. Meanwhile, Mrs. Banbury was quietly sifting through the pages of the parish newsletter, but listening intently as Miss Kitty Penhaligon fluttered about with the eagerness of a nervous sparrow. The Major, predictably, grumbled about the lack of order, refusing to entertain the idea that one of their own could be capable of murder. In the market, the butcher was overheard saying, "It's the family secrets, you see." Always the family secrets. If that letter's true, there's a past someone's desperate to keep buried. Even the doctor, who rarely spoke beyond the bounds of his surgery, was drawn into conversation by a concerned parishioner. "I don't like it, that's all." A man stabbed in his own study. Too close to home for comfort, Miss Marple herself took a slow stroll through the village lanes, her keen eyes noting the flickers of nervous glances exchanged in shop windows, and the sudden silences when she passed. The weight of history hung over the village, a delicate tension between past and present that threatened to snap. That afternoon at Elderberry Lodge, the investigation gathered momentum. Inspector Finch had returned with a small team, methodically cataloguing the scene and speaking with anyone who had been present. Miss Marple offered her assistance, though with her trademark modesty. She framed it as idle curiosity rather than the keen scrutiny that it truly was. The police were quick to identify Reginald's recent disputes as potential motives. He had been involved in a series of property negotiations, and some villagers whispered that he was less than scrupulous in his dealings. A few names surfaced, those who had suffered under Reginald's sharp tongue or had been outbid on parcels of land that meant more than mere acreage. Yet, as Miss Marple quietly listened, she sensed that these surface grievances were distractions, red herrings to focus attention away from deeper wounds. The letter, still resting on the mahogany desk, was examined closely. Its contents remained unknown to all but one. Miss Marple herself had managed to glimpse the faint outline of faded writing when the envelope had briefly caught the afternoon light. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink blotched in places as if penned in haste or distress. She knew the letter was key, but what secrets did it hold? And who, in this tight-knit village, had such a vested interest in its silence? Later that evening, as the household gathered reluctantly for dinner under the strained atmosphere, Miss Marple found herself seated beside Caroline Amesbury. The young woman looked fragile, her usual cheerful manner dimmed by the events. "Reginald was complicated, yes," Caroline admitted, quietly. "He held grudges, but I never thought it would come to this. And that letter, I still can't understand why it was returned after all these years. Who could have sent it, and why now?" Miss Marple smiled gently, stirring her tea. Sometimes, the past waits patiently for the right moment to resurface. And when it does, it can change everything. As the conversation drifted, other guests exchanged wary glances, their faces shadows of concealed thoughts. The vicar's wife was the first to break the silence, mentioning in a clipped tone that perhaps the letter related to the Lonsdale tragedy all those years ago. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Indeed, Beatrice Lonsdale's death was never fully explained, a tragedy shrouded in unanswered questions. And now, Caroline added, it seems the past has reached into the present. The night deepened with uneasy silence, but Miss Marple's mind was already turning, piecing together the subtle hints that the village had unwittingly laid bare. The letter was more than an artifact. It was a catalyst, a messenger from a time when secrets had been carefully hidden but never healed. She would need to speak with more villagers, uncover their histories and their fears, and watch carefully for the inconsistencies in their stories. In St. Bede's, nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Outside, the moon cast a silver glow over Elderberry Lodge, the garden quiet but for the rustling of leaves. Somewhere beneath that serene surface, the truth waited to be uncovered, tangled in the past and carried by the letter returned from the dead. The morning after Reginald Bretherton's murder dawned overcast and cool, the kind of day where the sun's warmth felt like a promise rather than a certainty. The village of St. Bede's awoke slowly, as if reluctant to face the unsettling reality that had descended upon it. Doors closed a little more firmly, footsteps quickened, and eyes flickered nervously in greeting or avoidance. Miss Marple rose with the dawn, as she often did, preparing her modest breakfast with the steady, comforting rhythm that grounded her thoughts. Today, the usual piece of her morning routine was tinged with anticipation, a quiet urgency to begin piecing together the scattered fragments of the previous day's tragedy. She set out soon after, her walking stick tapping lightly on the worn stone path as she made her way toward Elderberry Lodge. The village was quieter than usual. The marketplace was sparsely populated, and conversations hushed at her approach. Yet in those whispered words, Miss Marple found more than idle gossip. She detected the undercurrents of fear, suspicion, and secrets trembling just beneath the surface. Arriving at the lodge, she was greeted by Caroline Amesbury, whose eyes betrayed the exhaustion and strain that the events had wrought. "Jane," she said softly, "thank you for coming. It's all so dreadful. The police have been asking questions, but I'm afraid no one's sure who to trust anymore." Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. "Sometimes, Caroline, it is the quiet observations we make between the questions that reveal the truth." Inside, Inspector Finch was already busy coordinating the investigation. He acknowledged Miss Marple's arrival with a polite nod, but made clear his desire to keep the official inquiry separate from any amateur sleuthing. Nevertheless, he allowed her access to the study where Reginald had been found, perhaps sensing that her presence did no harm. The room retained its somber stillness, the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains and casting delicate patterns on the polished floor. The mahogany desk remained central, the letter envelope still resting atop the scattered papers. Miss Marple approached it with care, turning it over once again in her hands. She noticed now the faint indentation of writing on the back, as if the letter's message had been pressed hard with a sense of urgency. The script was delicate but hurried, the words partially obscured by age, but not entirely illegible. Her eyes scanned the words she could discern. "My dearest Beatrice, if you receive this, know that all is not as it seems. Trust no one in Elderberry Lodge. Danger lurks where you least expect it." The rest was faint, but the tone was unmistakably one of warning. Miss Marple's heart quickened ever so slightly. Here was a secret, long buried, now clawing its way to the surface. She turned her attention to the room's other details. The positioning of objects, the absence of disturbance beyond the fatal wound. Reginald's body had been found slumped forward, but there was no sign of struggle. The letter opener, though deadly, was a common desk accessory, not a weapon brought with intent from elsewhere. This suggested to Miss Marple a crime born of impulse or desperation, rather than premeditation. Later, she sought out the villagers individually, beginning with Mrs. Banbury. The retired schoolmistress was a well of knowledge about the village's history, and Miss Marple knew that understanding the past was essential to untangling the present. Beatrice Lonsdale's death was whispered about for years, Mrs. Banbury confided as they sat by the fire in Miss Marple's sitting room. She was bright and full of life, but her marriage to Charles Lonsdale was troubled. There were rumors of infidelity, and some said Charles was a cruel man. The night she drowned, it was said she'd argued fiercely with him. "And yet it was ruled an accident," Miss Marple murmured. "Officially, yes," Mrs. Banbury agreed, "but some of us never quite believed it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The letter's warning suggests that Beatrice may have feared for her life, or at least suspected that those around her were not to be trusted. As the day unfolded, Miss Marple continued her quiet inquiries. She spoke with Clara Amesbury, the maid, who seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the tragedy but provided useful observations. Clara mentioned how Reginald had been unusually agitated in the days leading up to the fete. He had spent long hours in the study, muttering to himself and refusing to explain the source of his distress. "He was always fussing over that letter and the desk," Clara said. "Said something about the past coming back to haunt us. I thought it was just one of his schemes." Miss Marple made a mental note of this. The past had indeed returned, and it was no mere coincidence. Next, she sought out Major Penhaligon, whose brusque manner belied a sharp mind. Over cups of strong tea in the village hall, the Major grumbled about the disruption to the fete, but conceded that Reginald had many enemies. "Too many, if you ask me," he muttered. Reginald wasn't one to make friends, especially where money or property was concerned. He stepped on toes. Some might say he pushed folks a bit too hard. "Did you notice anything unusual about Reginald's behavior lately?" Miss Marple asked. The Major tapped his fingers on the table. "Well, now that you mention it, yes. He seemed more secretive, more jumpy. And the letter that caught him off guard when it turned up. I reckon someone wanted to unsettle him." The pattern was becoming clearer. The letter was a message, deliberately delivered after all these years, stirring old wounds and threatening to expose something someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. Miss Marple's instincts told her that Reginald's murder was not random. It was a response, a desperate act to silence him before the truth emerged. As the day slipped toward evening, Miss Marple found herself back at Elderberry Lodge, standing once again beneath the willow tree in the garden. The roses still bloomed, and the village's unease lingered like a mist. She reflected on the fragments she had gathered. The letter's ominous warning, Reginald's agitation, the village's hidden resentments. Somewhere beneath the polite facades and gentle smiles, a darker story was waiting. Miss Marple was certain that the key lay not in forensic clues, but in human nature. The small tells, the slips of the tongue, the half-hidden fears. And she would watch closely, waiting for those subtle signs to reveal the truth behind the letter returned from the dead. The days that followed Reginald Bretherton's murder unfolded with a peculiar rhythm in St. Bede's, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter in a story none dared fully acknowledge. Inspector Finch, pressed by the pressures of duty and the expectations of his superiors, moved swiftly to identify suspects and close the case. Yet, amid his brisk officialdom, Miss Marple observed with the patient curiosity of one who knew that human nature rarely yielded to simple explanations. From the earliest inquiries, two names rose quickly to the surface. Edward Mallory, Reginald's neighbor and frequent adversary in the property disputes, and Caroline Amesbury, Reginald's niece and the young woman who had discovered the body. Both presented plausible motives and each harbored secrets that cast shadows upon their innocence. Edward Mallory, a gruff man with a face weathered by years of toil and worry, had clashed openly with Reginald over the sale of a parcel of land near the village green. "That land is rightfully mine," Edward declared to anyone who would listen, his jaw tight and eyes fierce. "Reginald tried to cheat me out of it, and I wasn't going to stand for it." At the police station, his interviews were marked by defensiveness, a mixture of indignation and frustration. Yet Miss Marple, watching from a quiet corner of the room, noted something more, a hint of reluctance beneath the bravado, a hesitation when questioned about his whereabouts the night of the murder. Caroline Amesbury, by contrast, presented as fragile and overwhelmed, her grief mingled with bewilderment. She recounted the events leading to her discovery of her uncle's body with a trembling voice, insisting she had no knowledge of who could have wanted to harm him. However, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to small inconsistencies, a fleeting look exchanged with another guest at the fete, a hesitation when asked about the letter, and a guarded way of speaking about her uncle's recent behavior. As the police gathered statements, it became clear that the village itself was divided. Some residents whispered of Edward's temper and long-standing feud. Others expressed sympathy for Caroline, suggesting that the pressures of her family's reputation weighed heavily upon her. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced that the truth lay in these apparent conflicts alone. She reflected on the letter, with its faded ink and ominous warning, and the past it alluded to. To uncover more, she arranged to visit the village archives, seeking records of Beatrice Lonsdale's tragic death all those years ago. The dusty ledgers and yellowed newspapers told a story of sorrow, scandal, and unanswered questions. Beatrice's drowning had been ruled accidental, but whispers of unhappiness, betrayal, and hidden grievances lingered. Returning to the present, Miss Marple met with the vicar, Reverend Hargreaves, a man whose gentle demeanor concealed a keen intellect. Over a modest lunch in the church hall, they discussed the villagers' reactions and the subtle tensions that had long simmered beneath polite smiles. "St. Bede's is not as peaceful as it appears," the Reverend said softly. "There are wounds here, old grievances that few dare to speak aloud. The letter has disturbed more than just Reginald's peace. It has unsettled the entire community." Miss Marple nodded. "Secrets, Reverend, have a way of surfacing at the most inconvenient times." She also sought out Clara Amesbury again, the maid, hoping to glean more from her quiet observations. Clara admitted she had overheard a heated argument between Reginald and an unknown visitor just days before the fete, words laced with anger and fear. "Reginald was frightened," Clara confided. "He said, 'They won't let the past lie.' But I never knew what he meant." As these pieces came together, the investigation took on new dimensions. Inspector Finch, under pressure to solve the crime swiftly, focused on the tangible, the disputes, the apparent motives. Miss Marple, by contrast, listened to the silences, watched the glances, and pieced together the emotional currents beneath the surface. One afternoon, while strolling through the village square, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Withers, the ever-curious widow whose penchant for gossip was matched only by her sharp eye for detail. Over cups of tea at the tea-room, Mrs. Withers shared what she had gleaned from overheard conversations. "Did you hear about the late-night visitor at Elderberry Lodge? A stranger, they say, who left as quickly as he arrived. No one knows his name, but his presence stirred quite the talk." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet interest. Strangers rarely arrive without reason in a village like this. The stranger, it seemed, had appeared just before the murder, his visit a mystery no one had yet solved. As the investigation progressed, Miss Marple found herself piecing together a tapestry of past grievances, unspoken fears, and carefully concealed alliances. The letter was a thread running through it all, its message a warning and a key to understanding the deadly events. One evening, as the village settled under a blanket of stars, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the letter before her once more. She allowed her thoughts to wander through the faces and voices of those she had spoken with. Edward's anger, Caroline's grief, the vicar's quiet wisdom, Clara's whispered fears, Mrs. Withers's eager observations. Each held a piece of the puzzle, but none yet revealed the whole picture. In the shadows beyond the lamp's glow, Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, her deductions forming with the precision of a watchmaker's hands. She knew the solution would come not from force or haste, but from patience and the subtle reading of human nature. The village of St. Bede's had secrets, indeed, but it was not only the past that had led to murder, it was the present's fear of that past being unveiled. Miss Marple was certain that, soon, the truth would speak for itself, carried on the whisper of a returned letter and the weight of long-hidden betrayals. Miss Marple's quiet observations and the village's muted unease seemed to converge one afternoon when she returned to Elderberry Lodge to revisit the study, hoping the room might yet yield some overlooked detail. The house was still shrouded in a heavy silence, as if the walls themselves mourned Reginald's passing. She entered alone, the wooden floor creaking faintly beneath her feet, and approached the desk once again, careful not to disturb anything. Her eyes rested on the letter, still sealed in its envelope, but now clearly bearing the telltale signs of age and care. Miss Marple took a delicate breath and examined the desk surface closely. It was a grand piece of furniture, polished to a high sheen, yet the years of use had left subtle marks. A faint ring from a teacup, scratches made by restless fingers, and a small, almost imperceptible discoloration beneath a pile of papers. Her fingers traced the edge of that pale spot, and a thought struck her. A letter had been pressed against that spot for a long time, shielding the wood from the light. She pulled back the papers and found another envelope, tucked away and somewhat concealed beneath a sheaf of financial documents. The envelope was addressed simply, "To Beatrice, should she ever return." The handwriting was the same as the letter Reginald had received. Intrigued, Miss Marple carefully opened the envelope and withdrew its contents, a brittle, folded sheet of paper that smelled faintly of lavender and old parchment. The writing was faded but legible, and the tone was urgent, desperate even. "My dear Beatrice, if you are reading this, then the danger is near, and you must know the truth. The man you trust most is not as he seems. Beware the shadows cast by those closest to you." The letter ended abruptly, the rest of the page torn away as if someone had tried to prevent its full revelation. Miss Marple's mind began to weave connections. This was no mere warning. It was a fragment of a secret, one that had survived decades but had clearly unsettled Reginald enough to lead him to seek it out and hold it close. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Caroline Amesbury entered, her expression tentative. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple," she said softly. I wanted to ask if there was any news." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "Caroline, sometimes the smallest details reveal the greatest truths. Do you recall if your uncle ever mentioned this second letter?" Caroline shook her head. "No, I didn't know it existed." "But you did say he was agitated by the letter he received just before the fete?" "Yes. He was nervous, more than I'd ever seen him. He kept going over something, muttering about the past. I thought it was worry over the land, but now I'm not sure." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Worries, especially long-held ones, have a habit of resurfacing at inconvenient times." Later that day, Miss Marple shared her discovery with Inspector Finch, who was less than impressed. "More old letters? I'm afraid that won't get us any closer to a murderer, Miss Marple. We need facts, not faded warnings." "Sometimes, Inspector," Miss Marple replied softly. "Facts come disguised as shadows and whispers." Undeterred, she pursued another line of inquiry. She returned to Clara Amesbury, the maid, hoping to glean more about the visitors to Elderberry Lodge in recent days. Clara hesitated, but eventually admitted she had seen the stranger mentioned by Mrs. Withers, an unfamiliar man who came calling late in the evening a few nights before the fete. "He was quiet, and he didn't stay long," Clara said. "But he seemed to upset Mr. Bretherton." They spoke in hushed tones, and I could hear a woman's voice on the phone shortly after he left. Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. Who was this stranger, and what did he want with Reginald, and what woman's voice had echoed after his departure? Her questions soon led her to Mrs. Marigold Crane, the village postmistress, who had noticed unusual activity at the village mailbox that week. "Letters came and went for Elderberry Lodge," she said, "more than usual." I thought it odd, but said nothing. With this information, Miss Marple surmised that Reginald had been receiving correspondence beyond the mysterious letter, possibly from the stranger or the woman on the phone. The pieces began to fit together, but a crucial link was still missing. One afternoon, while walking near the old mill pond, a spot that had figured in the tragic death of Beatrice Lonsdale years ago, Miss Marple stopped to inspect the reeds and water's edge. Her eye caught a glint of something partially buried beneath fallen leaves and mud. Kneeling, she retrieved a small, intricately carved locket, tarnished by time but unmistakably elegant. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman and a man, their faces close, smiles hinting at a shared secret. Miss Marple's heart stirred. The woman bore a striking resemblance to Caroline Amesbury, but with softer eyes and a different era's attire. The man was unknown. This locket was more than a keepsake. It was a relic of the past, a token that tied the present to long-buried history. Returning to the village, Miss Marple sought out Caroline once more, gently showing her the locket. "Do you recognize this, Caroline?" Caroline's hands trembled as she took the locket, her eyes misting with sudden tears. "It belonged to my mother." "I thought it lost long ago," Miss Marple nodded. Your mother's story may be key to understanding what your uncle feared and who might have wanted him silenced. Caroline swallowed hard, then admitted a secret she had held close. Her mother, it seemed, had been connected to Beatrice Lonsdale in ways few knew. There had been friendship, rivalry, and perhaps betrayal. The village's calm facade was cracking, revealing a labyrinth of relationships tangled by time. Miss Marple realized that Reginald's murder was the culmination of decades of hidden enmities and painful truths that some still feared to face. As dusk fell over St. Bede's, the shadows lengthened, carrying with them the weight of secrets yearning for daylight. Miss Marple prepared herself to navigate the intricate web of human emotions and lies, knowing that the path to justice required more than evidence. It demanded understanding the delicate balance of trust and deception, and somewhere within the quiet village, the final pieces awaited discovery, promising to unmask the darkness beneath the letter returned from the dead. The discovery of the locket marked a subtle turning point in the quiet yet persistent unraveling of the mystery. It was not, Miss Marple knew, the revelation itself that would resolve the tangled threads, but rather the way it stirred the currents beneath the surface, prompting hesitations, revealing fractures, and unsettling the carefully constructed facades of the village folk. Caroline Amesbury, still clutching the locket with trembling hands, had become more withdrawn since their last conversation. Miss Marple, ever sensitive to the nuances of human behavior, sensed a shift, an internal struggle that was only partially spoken. She understood that some truths, once unearthed, demanded courage beyond the usual bounds of everyday life. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple paid a call on Edward Mallory. The man's gruff exterior softened when she approached, not as an accuser, but as a fellow witness to the weight of secrets. His weather-beaten face bore traces of exhaustion that no amount of bravado could conceal. "Edward," she began, "the past has a peculiar way of coming back to remind us of things best left forgotten. But sometimes it's only by facing these things that we find peace." Edward sighed deeply. "I'm no stranger to the past, Miss Marple. I've seen enough sorrow in my time, but I don't understand what this has to do with Reginald's death." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "You and Reginald had your differences, certainly. But the letter and the locket suggest that the story is much larger than a simple dispute over land." He nodded slowly, his eyes clouded with memories. "There was more between our families than just land. Old wounds, old promises broken. I just hoped it would never come to this." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Finch, who, despite his earlier dismissal of the old letters, now appeared unsettled by the growing complexity of the case. "Miss Marple," Finch said, "there's been a development. A witness came forward, an elderly man who claims to have seen a figure near the mill pond on the night Reginald was killed." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "And who might this witness be?" "Mr. Thomas Ridley. He lives on the outskirts, a recluse by all accounts. But he says he saw someone hurriedly leaving the area around the time of the murder." Miss Marple immediately saw the value in speaking with Mr. Ridley. The village's peripheral residents often held the sharpest insights, unnoticed by the bustling centre. That evening, she accompanied Inspector Finch to Mr. Ridley's modest cottage. The old man greeted them with wary eyes, but a kindness lingered beneath his cautious demeanor. "I don't usually talk to folk about such things," Mr. Ridley began, "but that night I saw a figure I didn't recognize. Tall, thin, moving quickly and looking over his shoulder. He carried a package or a bundle wrapped in cloth. Didn't see his face properly, but he didn't look like any of the villagers." Miss Marple pressed gently. "Did you notice anything else? A sound? A direction?" He nodded. "He went toward the churchyard." Strange, since the village was quiet, no one about at that hour. Returning to the village, Miss Marple contemplated the significance of the stranger's path. The churchyard, with its old graves and quiet corners, had long been a place where secrets were whispered but rarely uncovered. The following morning, she made her way there, treading softly among the moss-covered stones. Near a weathered gravestone, she found disturbed earth, a faint impression in the soil suggesting something had been buried or unearthed recently. With a small spade borrowed from a nearby gardener, she carefully cleared the area and uncovered a small box, damp and muddy but intact. Inside lay a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. The documents were letters, correspondence between Beatrice Lonsdale and an unknown recipient. The tone was tender yet urgent, filled with coded phrases and references to dangers and betrayals. One letter spoke of a plan to reveal a truth that would change everything, while another hinted at a promise made to protect a secret at all costs. Miss Marple's heart quickened. These letters were the missing pieces, the whispers of a story long buried beneath polite village life. She brought the letters to Reverend Hargreaves, who listened with a grave expression. "This changes much," he said. "The past we thought settled was merely concealed. The weight of that history may be the key to understanding Reginald's fate." Meanwhile, word of the discovery spread through the village, stoking whispers and apprehensions. Some villagers, previously reluctant to speak, began to share memories of old rivalries and alliances, of promises made in haste and regrets kept in silence. Caroline Amesbury, summoned to the churchyard by Miss Marple, faced the letters with a mixture of fear and determination. "These were my mother's words," she admitted softly. She wanted the truth to be known, but feared what it might cost. Miss Marple took her hand. "Truth, my dear, is often a heavy burden, but it can also be a light that guides us through the darkness." The pieces were coming together, but Miss Marple understood that the final revelations were still veiled behind layers of human complexity. That evening, as she sat by the fire in her cozy cottage, her thoughts returned to the stranger Mr. Ridley had seen. Who was he? What was the bundle he carried? And how was he connected to the secrets unfolding in St. Bede's? Miss Marple knew that to unmask the murderer, she would have to step deeper into the shadows of the village's past and provoke the truths that some wished would remain forever hidden. The letter returned from the dead was more than a message. It was a summons to confront the ghosts lingering among the living, and Miss Marple, with her gentle wit and unwavering resolve, was prepared to answer that call. The days that followed the discovery of the letters were filled with an uneasy tension that seemed to settle over St. Bede's like a dense fog. The villagers, once content to whisper behind cupped hands, now found themselves drawn into conversations tinged with suspicion and unease. Even the oldest residents, who had long regarded the past as closed book, now exchanged furtive glances and half-spoken fears. Miss Marple, ever observant, noted the subtle shifts in demeanor as she moved through the village. The butcher, who had greeted her warmly just days before, now barely returned her nod. The vicar's wife, usually chatty and cheerful, offered only terse replies when pressed about the village's history. It was as if the buried secrets stirred a collective discomfort, a fear that unearthing them might bring more harm than good. Yet Miss Marple knew better. Truth, however painful, was the only path forward. Caroline Amesbury, caught in the midst of this gathering storm, found herself increasingly isolated. She spent long hours in her small room at Elderberry Lodge, clutching the locket and letters like lifelines. Miss Marple visited often, sensing that Caroline needed more than comfort. She needed reassurance that facing the past was a brave, necessary act. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the village green, Miss Marple and Caroline sat quietly in the drawing-room. The silence between them was gentle but heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Caroline," Miss Marple began softly, "secrets have a way of shaping us, don't they? But they can also protect and poison in equal measure. Caroline nodded, her eyes glistening. Mother never spoke much about her past. I always thought she wanted to forget. Now, I wonder if she was trying to protect me. Miss Marple reached out and took Caroline's hand. Sometimes protection comes from silence, but sometimes it comes from courage. It's not too late to choose. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Edward Mallory, looking more weary than usual. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "there's been an incident at the mill." They followed him quickly to the scene. The old mill, a relic from a bygone era, stood near the river's edge, its water wheels silent and moss-covered. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring anxiously. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked. Inspector Finch, already present, stepped forward. "A break-in. Someone's tried to force open the old storage room. We found footprints leading away toward the village, but no sign of the intruder." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the surroundings, noting the disturbed earth and a faint trail of torn fabric caught on a thorn bush. It was clear the intruder had been in haste, perhaps disturbed by a passer-by. "Do we know what they were after?" she inquired. "Not yet," Finch replied. "The mill hasn't been used in years, but old documents or keepsakes might be stored inside." Miss Marple's thoughts raced. The mill had been a meeting place decades ago, linked to the stories she had heard about Beatrice and Reginald's families. Could the intruder be searching for more evidence of old secrets? Or was this a warning, an attempt to intimidate? That evening, Miss Marple returned to Elderberry Lodge to share the news with Caroline. The girl's face paled. "Do you think they know about the letters? About Mother's past?" "It seems so," Miss Marple said gently. "Someone is desperate to keep the truth buried." In the days that followed, the investigation took on a new urgency. Miss Marple began to piece together the movements of those connected to Elderberry Lodge. She learned that the stranger Mr. Ridley had seen was no ordinary visitor. Local gossip hinted at a man recently arrived in St. Bede's, known only as Mr. Holloway, who kept to himself but had been seen speaking privately with Edward Mallory. Curious, Miss Marple sought out Holloway, finding him at a small inn on the village outskirts. The man was composed, with sharp eyes that missed little. He admitted to meeting Edward but denied any involvement with the murder or the break-in. "My interest," Holloway explained, "is in the history of these families. I'm a researcher, uncovering forgotten stories." Miss Marple sensed truth in his words, though the man's presence added another layer of complexity. Was he a friend or a foe in this delicate dance? Back at the village, tensions escalated. The local newspaper printed a speculative article, stoking fears and accusations. Villagers whispered of curses and retribution, of debts unpaid and wrongs avenged. One evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Dr. James Farrow, the village physician. His normally steady hands trembled as he handed her a small envelope. "I found this among Reginald's effects," he said. "It's a note, hurriedly written, but it might shed light on his final hours." Miss Marple unfolded the paper with care. The note was brief but pointed. "The past is catching up. Trust no one." The letter was only the beginning. The message was chilling in its brevity and urgency. Reginald had been aware of imminent danger but was unable to name his assailant. Miss Marple's mind circled back to Caroline and the locket, to the letters buried by the mill and the stranger's hurried flight. The village, it seemed, was caught in the grip of a story that had begun long ago and had finally reached its deadly conclusion. As she walked home beneath a sky thick with stars, Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of resolve. The game was no longer one of shadows, but of light, each step drawing her closer to the heart of the mystery. She would watch, listen, and wait, knowing that in the quiet moments between words and deeds, the truth would reveal itself. And when it did, The letter returned from the dead would finally speak its secret aloud. The village of St. Bede's wore its usual quiet facade as dawn spilled pale light over thatched roofs and cobblestone lanes, but beneath that calm surface, the undercurrents of anxiety ran swift and restless. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite armchair by the parlor window, sipped her tea slowly, her thoughts returning to the doctor's note, the stark warning Reginald had scrawled in his final moments. The past is catching up. Trust no one. The words lingered like a shadow across her mind. The letter, the locket, the cryptic correspondence buried beneath the old gravestone, the break-in at the mill. All these threads were converging, weaving a web that held secrets far older and more tangled than anyone had yet dared to admit. But Miss Marple knew that to unravel the mystery fully, she would need to look beyond the obvious and watch closely the interplay of human nature in this small village still gripped by suspicion. She decided to begin the day by visiting the village hall, where the recent gatherings and whispers had stirred uneasy gossip. As she walked through the quiet streets, she noted the furtive glances cast her way, some wary, others curious. The news of the break-in and the letters had unsettled many, and already the village's usual harmony was fraying at the edges. Inside the hall, a small group had gathered. Caroline Amesbury was there, her hands clenched tightly around a handkerchief. Edward Mallory stood apart, his face a mask of grim determination, and to Miss Marple's slight surprise, Reverend Hargreaves was present, speaking quietly with Inspector Finch. The vicar caught her eye and gave a slight nod as she approached. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming. We thought it prudent to discuss what must be done next." The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the hall clock. Caroline's voice, fragile but steady, was the first to break it. "I don't understand why all this is happening. Mother's secrets, the letters. It feels as if the past is attacking us all." Edward's jaw tightened. Secrets or no, Reginald's death was no accident. Someone wanted him gone, and the answers lie buried deeper than any of us imagined. Miss Marple smiled gently. A quiet reassurance. Indeed. But the answers will come. Sometimes the hardest part is recognizing the truths when they reveal themselves. Inspector Finch, looking tired but resolute, cleared his throat. "We've reviewed Mr. Ridley's statement and Mr. Holloway's whereabouts on the night in question. Holloway claims to have been researching in the village archives, but some of his answers don't quite add up." The mention of Holloway drew Caroline's gaze. "He seemed earnest when I met him." "I didn't think he had any reason to lie," Miss Marple observed carefully. "In matters of this sort, earnestness can sometimes be a mask, but it may also be genuine. We must remain open to both possibilities." The vicar interjected. "There's something else. I came across an old parish record indicating a long-forgotten scandal between the Mallory and Lonsdale families, a dispute over a will and a child believed to have been lost or hidden." A murmur ran through the room. Caroline's face paled, and Edward looked away, his features hardening. Miss Marple's mind pieced together the fragments. A lost child, a disputed inheritance, veiled threats. It all hinted at a deeper motive. "This may explain why Reginald was so fearful in his final days," she said quietly. "If someone believed a secret might surface that would threaten their position, they would do anything to keep it concealed." Caroline broke down, tears spilling freely. "Mother told me once about a child, but she warned me never to ask. I thought it was just an old family tale." Edward finally spoke, voice low and urgent. "That child may still be here, hidden in plain sight. And if they are, they could hold the key to everything." Miss Marple regarded each face in turn, noting the guarded expressions and subtle signs of anxiety. The village, it seemed, was a stage for hidden dramas, where every smile masked a story, every glance a secret. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple found herself walking the lanes toward Elderberry Lodge. Caroline had invited her for tea, and the two had grown closer in recent days. The girl's vulnerability was matched by a growing determination to face whatever shadows her mother had left behind. Inside, the fire cast a warm glow, softening the tension that clung to the air. Caroline unfolded the letters once more, tracing the faded ink with trembling fingers. "Do you think Mother feared for her life?" she asked. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Fear often walks hand in hand with knowledge. The truth can be dangerous, especially when it threatens to upset the delicate balance of power. A sudden knock at the door startled them. Caroline opened it to reveal a young woman, her cheeks flushed with urgency. "Miss Amesbury," she said breathlessly, "I believe you need to see this." The woman handed over a newspaper clipping, yellowed but clearly recent, detailing a discovery at the village church. A hidden compartment behind the altar, containing documents related to the Lonsdale estate and a list of names, some unfamiliar. Caroline's eyes widened. "This could be the proof we need." Miss Marple studied the clipping carefully. "And proof of what has been kept hidden for so long." The next morning, Miss Marple joined Inspector Finch and Reverend Hargreaves at the church. The compartment had been carefully opened, revealing a trove of papers, legal documents, letters, and photographs. Among them was a faded photograph of a young woman holding a child, the caption revealing her as Beatrice Lonsdale. The child's face was partially obscured, but something about the image struck Miss Marple. A hint of familiarity, a resemblance to someone she had seen before. Reverend Hargreaves sighed. "It seems the story is far from over. The question is, who among us is connected to these shadows?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. "And who has the most to lose if these truths come to light?" As the day stretched on, she quietly observed the villagers who came to see the documents. Their reactions were telling. Some avoided the papers entirely. Others studied them with a nervous intensity. Miss Marple felt the invisible threads pulling tighter, knowing the moment of confrontation was drawing near. That night, as the village settled into uneasy sleep, a figure slipped silently along the churchyard path. A shadow moving with purpose and a heart heavy with secrets. Miss Marple, from her window, saw the flicker of a lantern and knew the letter returned from the dead was about to reveal its final, deadly truth. The cold night air was thick with silence, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves as the figure moved cautiously through the churchyard, lantern held low to avoid drawing attention. The flicker of light played against the stone walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with secret purpose. Miss Marple, from her window across the lane, watched with a calm intensity, her keen eyes noting every measured step, every glance over the shoulder. This was no casual visitor. The urgency in the stranger's movement spoke of desperation, of a truth too dangerous to expose in daylight. Yet, despite the caution, the figure's presence was a sign. A crack in the carefully maintained silence that cloaked the village's past. Inside the church, the door creaked open, and the visitor slipped inside, the lantern's light illuminating the ancient pews and the high altar where the hidden compartment had been uncovered just days before. The papers and photographs now lay spread on a small table, evidence of long-buried connections and tangled histories. The stranger's hand trembled as they reached for the documents, fingers brushing over the faded ink, the familiar faces. The names that spelled out stories of love, betrayal, and loss. The weight of generations pressed heavily, as if these fragile papers held not only the truth, but the power to upend the delicate balance of the village's social order. Outside, footsteps approached, soft, deliberate. The figure froze, heart pounding, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the movement through the window. It was Edward Mallory, moving with purpose, yet cautious enough to avoid startling the intruder. Edward stepped inside, his voice low but firm. "You shouldn't be here." The stranger turned, the lantern revealing a face lined with worry, but resolute. Nor should you, Edward. But the time has come for the truth. The tension between them was palpable, years of silence and suspicion compressing into this moment of confrontation. Miss Marple, from her vantage point, could sense the fragile threads ready to snap, and she quietly left her chair to seek assistance, knowing the village constable was nearby. Within the church, Edward's expression softened slightly. "What is it that you want?" "To be heard," the stranger replied. "To right a wrong that has shadowed this place for too long." Their words stirred a memory in Miss Marple. Fragments from the letters, the locket, and the photographs all converging toward a revelation that had evaded her grasp until now. She returned to the window, watching and listening, prepared to step in when the moment was ripe. The stranger's voice trembled with emotion as they spoke. Beatrice Lonsdale was more than just a woman wronged by circumstance. She was a mother who lost her child, taken away to protect the family name, hidden from those who might use the truth for their gain. Edward's gaze dropped. "You know this for certain?" "I do," the stranger said quietly, "because I am that child." A stunned silence followed. Edward's face went pale, the realization hitting him like a blow. You're the missing Lonsdale heir?" "Yes," the stranger confirmed. "And the letters, the locket, they were my mother's way of reaching out, even in death." Miss Marple stepped forward then, her presence calm but commanding. "It seems the past has finally spoken its secret aloud." The stranger looked toward her, relief and uncertainty mingling in their eyes. "Miss Marple, I had hoped you might help bring this truth into the light." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Truth, once revealed, must be met with courage, and those who hear it must be willing to face the consequences." Edward swallowed hard, the weight of years pressing down on him. Why now? Why come forward after all this time? The stranger glanced at the documents on the table. Because Reginald's death was no accident. Someone feared this truth and sought to silence it forever. The implication hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple's mind raced, recalling the intricate dance of secrets, lies, and half-truths that had marked the investigation. The letter returned from the dead had led them here, to a revelation that promised justice but threatened to unravel the lives entwined with it. Outside, footsteps grew louder, and Miss Marple moved to intercept the approaching constable. Together, they entered the church, ready to ensure that the fragile peace of St. Bede's would not be shattered by violence, but healed through truth. As dawn broke over the village, the long-hidden story began to unfold in full. The missing child reclaimed, the bitter resentments confronted, and the shadows that had haunted Elderberry Lodge finally dispelled. The villagers gathered, wary but hopeful, as Miss Marple gently explained the tangled web of past grievances and the courage it took to lay them bare. Caroline Amesbury, standing beside her newfound relative, felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. The locket, once a symbol of mystery and loss, now shone with the promise of reconciliation and healing. And Miss Marple, ever composed, watched with quiet satisfaction. Human nature, she knew, was a tapestry of light and shadow, but when faced with kindness and truth, even the darkest secrets could find their rightful place. The letter returned from the dead had spoken at last, and the village of St. Bede's, though forever changed, could at last begin to heal. The morning sun spilled gently over St. Bede's, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch away from the recent darkness that had enveloped the village. Inside the cozy parlor of Miss Marple's cottage, the air was filled with a quiet anticipation. The villagers who had gathered, Caroline Amesbury, Edward Mallory, Reverend Hargreaves, Inspector Finch, and the stranger who had revealed herself as Beatrice Lonsdale, waited as Miss Marple, serene yet purposeful, prepared to bring the tangled mystery to its close. She began softly. This tale has been one of hidden truths and silent fears, but most of all, of human nature and the lengths to which people will go to protect what they hold dear. Her eyes swept the room, lingering momentarily on each face, reading the lines of hope, guilt, and relief. Reginald Ridley's death was not a simple accident, nor the rash act of a vengeful stranger, as some supposed. It was the consequence of a secret long buried, one tied to the Lonsdale family's history, a secret that some feared would destroy their place in the village. Miss Marple paused, allowing her words to settle. The letters found, the locket passed between generations, and the discovery in the church were pieces of a puzzle pointing to the lost heir, Beatrice's child, hidden away for fear of scandal. This child was taken from the village to protect reputations and fortunes, and many believed the secret was safe. She looked directly at Edward Mallory, whose face was a mixture of remorse and resignation. But someone knew the truth. Someone who feared exposure so much that they chose silence over conscience. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened ever so slightly. "Edward, it was you who orchestrated the events leading to Reginald's demise. Your efforts to conceal the past, to prevent the return of a rightful heir, drove you to desperate measures, including the letter meant to mislead and the break-in intended to intimidate." A gasp rippled through the room. Edward's composure faltered. "You have no proof," he stammered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of acknowledgement. "Proof, Edward," Miss Marple said gently, "comes not only from evidence but from understanding the human heart. The hesitation in your voice when questioned, the inconsistencies in your movements, and your keen interest in suppressing any mention of the Lonsdale legacy all spoke volumes long before this moment." She turned to Beatrice. "Your courage in stepping forward has lifted the veil of silence. Now the village can begin to heal, and the wrongs of the past may be set right." Inspector Finch stepped forward to place a firm but respectful hand on Edward's shoulder. "The law will take its course. But the truth is what matters most now." Caroline, tears glistening, took her mother's hand. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Without your insight, we might never have found the strength to face this." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle completed. "It is always a question of seeing what others overlook, the small things, the subtle signs that reveal the true nature beneath." As the villagers dispersed, the weight of hidden sorrows lifted like a morning mist. The village of St. Bede's, forever changed by the letter returned from the dead, now embraced a future where secrets no longer festered in shadows. And Miss Marple, with her gentle wisdom and unerring insight, resumed her place by the window, watchful, thoughtful, and ever ready to uncover the next mystery lying quietly beneath the surface of ordinary lives.